Hi gang, the holy ordos of the Emperor's Inquisition might seem pretty ubiquitous in 40k nowadays, given how often they're the main characters of things like novels, but in reality their development behind the scenes took quite a long time compared to other factions, and relied not on 40k as a tabletop war game, but on all the other things connected to it. So, let's unearth the mysterious origins of the early Inquisition. Did you know there's an entire second channel now with the Book Club and Tale of Four Gamers videos? Details down below, head over to subscribe. In Warhammer 40k, the Inquisition are one of the most powerful of the Imperium's many agencies, the instigators of many of the battles of the 41st millennium, and a terrifying symbol of the God Emperor's authority. The Inquisition are kind of a big part of the universe, but you don't really see them on the table very much. Inquisitors move in the shadows, orchestrating the wars of the Imperium rather than necessarily leading them, or investigating shadowy cults in the underhives of its planets rather than fighting through hordes of enemies on the battlefield. And that puts them in a weird place for an entire hobby based around a war game. The miniature battle game of Warhammer 40,000 has never really known exactly what to do with them, which is a shame because they're such an evocative piece of the lore. And what that means is that their development as a faction took a really long time, happening in fits and starts, and was very much dependent on the business practices of Games Workshop as a company and what they were choosing to prioritize at the time. So let's start this little retrospective by going back to the very start of 40k and finding out which bits of the classic inquisitorial lore came at what points, and why they were developed that way. As with a lot of these elements of 40k, the first mention of the Inquisition proper is in the very first edition of 40k, 1987's Rogue Trader, and many of the elements we're introduced to, of the classic roving Inquisitor, we'd probably recognise from this description. Inquisitors are special agents of the Imperium, free-roaming troubleshooters bound by no laws or authority. Every Inquisitor is empowered to investigate any possible or potential threat to the future of humanity, whether that threat comes in the form of political aggression, administrative inefficiency, or genetic deviation. There are no bounds to an Inquisitor's field of operation. Alien plots, mutation, corruption, crime, and incompetence all come under his jurisdiction. To any modern player of 40k, there are a lot of familiar elements here. The Inquisitors operate with a small personal staff or warband. They're often referred to as witch hunters. Even back then, they work alongside other branches of the Adeptus, and their work deals with the investigation, often of cults, which inevitably come under the sway of evil, warp aliens. Their leader is the first amongst equals, the Master of the Inquisition, who reports directly to the Emperor. But here is where we start to deviate. Since the Emperor back in Rogue Trader is a little different, the operatives described here seem to be a lot more knowledgeable about his plans and a bit less gothic, I suppose, than their modern counterparts. At this point in the 40k lore, there was no chaos yet. The warp was definitely full of evil warp aliens, but since the Realms of Chaos books hadn't been released, there were no chaos powers or gods, no Horus Heresy or Primarchs, and no dead Emperor. In fact, the Emperor, while still contained on the Golden Throne, was presented as very capable of giving orders and sort of managing his Imperium, his overarching goal being the shepherding of mankind's evolution into a psychic race. And the Inquisitors described here know a lot more about that mission than you'd expect. The Master of the Inquisition apparently meets directly with the Emperor regularly to communicate the findings of his agents, and regular Inquisitors all seem to not only be aware of the Emperor's plans, but to be very enthusiastic agents of them. The reason we're given for their frequent hunting of the mutants is so that the human gene pool evolves the way the Emperor wants it to. Generally, they feel in this little description a bit more like lone marshals in the Wild West than the army commanding mega authorities we're kind of used to now. They have no organization above the free roaming agent responding to requests from other Inquisitors as a matter of honor. They can requisition anyone in the Imperium, but this is mostly shown to mean regular humans. There's no mention here of requisitioning armies, and they have to ask other branches of the Adeptus for cooperation if they need backup. And all of that sort of tallies with the setting of early 40k. Rogue Trader was a skirmish game with maybe a couple of dozen models per side. Its scenarios set on remote planets far from Imperial rule, and the idea of essentially roaming lawmen and their small band of warriors that accompany them fits really neatly into that. In these pages of Rogue Trader, we are given 3 examples of Inquisitors, and it's here that people's recollection online gets a bit muddy. Firstly, we have this image, nope, not the famous one, this one, of an Inquisitor in a suit of power armor with this very distinctive flat-topped helmet. And next to him, we get a description of a different Inquisitor, maybe the most famous Inquisitor in the whole of 40k, the amazingly named Inquisitor Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau. A tireless exposer of psychic misdeeds and genetic deviance, he wears a suit of skin-tight power armor under a long enveloping cloak and disdains the wearing of a helmet in favor of civilian headwear. His favored weapon is the bolt pistol, but he also carries a power sword and a massive array of other weapons and equipment, from photo visors to digital weapons to cans of web solvent, so he can be ready for anything. And then, finally, we get this image, a very famous image you might have seen online of an Inquisitor in a yin-yang, I guess like armored t-shirt, some what look like boot-cut jeans, an overcoat, and who's armed with a chainsword. This is the roving lawman we're expecting from our bonkers 80s sci-fi game, but despite literally every article and video out there naming him as such, this is obviously not a description of Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau. I mean, is it? No powered armor, no long enveloping cloak, no power sword. This is a different guy altogether. So yes, 3 Inquisitors described here. Both of these illustrations would be turned into model form. In 1987's Mercenary set, released just after Rogue Trader, our flat-headed pal here appears as Inquisitor Augustus, and then later on in the first version of the Citadel combat cards, like basically Top Trump's game, he's shown as Lord Hagen, Imperial Inquisitor. So some people since then have decided that this model is Inquisitor Lord Augustus Hagen. Seems reasonable. But while this famous guy did also get a model, look at his little flares there, that model is not named. The model is just Inquisitor, released in 1988 as part of the Adventurers set. So not only is this guy not Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau, Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau has also never got a model or any official depiction in art, which I think we can all agree is a tragic shame. Anyway, the role of the Inquisition was then expanded through the life of the first edition of the game, partly through the Realm of Chaos books, which introduced like a lot of the big ideas of modern 40k, and partly through a book series so heretical that many dare not whisper its name, which we'll get to in a second. 1988's Slaves to Darkness introduced a bit of structure to the idea of Inquisitors with the Ordo Malleus, and along with it, kind of the Inquisition we know today. Realms of Chaos introduces the idea of the Chaos powers as the main threat to humanity. It details the Chaos gods and the Emperor's role in fighting them, and part of that is the Inquisition. The Ordo Malleus is a secretive order within the Inquisition dedicated not only to seeking out any form of demon or chaos incursion, they're known even then as the Daemonhunters, but who also serve as an internal police force charged with ensuring the moral purity of the regular rank-and-file Inquisitors. They also hunt down the Sensei, which is a whole other video. Rather than one of many Ordos, the Malleus here are presented as the highest level of authority within the Inquisition itself, a secret service within a secret service. Let the regular Inquisitors chase down rogue psychers and mutants. The Ordo Malleus are way more serious than that. They can demand troops from any part of the Imperium. They can even replace and execute the Master of the Inquisition themselves if they wish. They have a completely free hand to act under the authority of the Emperor's warrant. It's also given vastly more organisation and structure than the regular Inquisition. Its leaders consist of 169 Masters of the Ordo, below which Inquisitors are sorted into chambers practical by sector, first time we hear of that, and then chambers theoretical and historical for all the older Inquisitors who can no longer serve in the field. Our new Ordo Malleus are extremely likely to be Psychers, in fact Psychers strong enough to have been soul bonded to the Emperor, which is something that tends to be reserved for astropaths nowadays. And they're also noted as being very martial with increased combat skills. They're also very fond of executing any of the troops requisitioned to their service, or, in the case of Space Marines, just mind scrubbing them. But the exception to that is their new dedicated chapter, the Grey Knights, a chapter of Psychic Space Marines. The Grey Knights here are an army completely under the control of the Inquisition and part of its structures. Their Grand Master is stated to be an Inquisitor of the Ordo, rather than a Space Marine. That's not totally uncommon. Imperial commanders commanded Space Marine chapters back then, and they refer to themselves as the Ordo Malleus's Chamber Militant. Designated Chapter 666, they were founded by the Emperor shortly after the third founding, and then kept secret ever since. They don't fight as part of any other Space Marine task forces. When they do deploy, it's on the orders of only the Ordo Malleus, and it's only against the worst of demonic threats. Their squads often equipped with the most advanced technology, but curiously, no Terminators. The army list here just presents us with Malleus Daemonhunters in their apparently distinctive flat-headed power armor, regular Inquisitors, and then a generic power-armored Marine army. The Terminators would only come a year later in White Dwarf 114, along with the idea of their Nemesis force weapons, at that point usually halberds. There were a couple of models with swords, introduced a bit later, but that's all you got. And all of this was supported by a little range, introduced through 1988 and into 1989. We have more Imperial Inquisitors. Confusingly, the normal Inquisitors here are in the flat-headed armor, while their Ordo Malleus counterparts wore the more ornate armor shrouded in robes. We got the first range of Grey Knight Terminator models, and alongside them, two more Inquisitor models in Terminator armor. A regular Inquisitor sporting a period-appropriate goatee. He's shown in this image as Jack Draco, who we'll get to in a second, and a hooded Ordo Malleus version with our first sighting of a Psy Cannon. This was quite a lot for a faction that was very much a sideshow to the various full army releases that were coming out at the same time. In a couple of years, the Inquisition had gone from being a random band of roving mutant hunters, Wild West lawmen, to this secretive, hugely powerful, terrifying political edifice with great importance to the Imperium. But on the table, they were still very much a weird little offshoot of the real Imperial armies. Space Marines, Imperial Army itself, squats to a degree. But a new Games Workshop venture would push them into the spotlight a bit more. 1990's Inquisitor by Ian Watson was the very first Warhammer novel, and its subject, unsurprisingly, is the Inquisition. It tells the story of Jack Draco, an Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus and his small band of advisors, a polymorphine-using assassin, a squat, and a navigator, as they uncover a massive conspiracy amongst the Inquisition itself. A plan by the even more secret Ordo Hydra to attempt to use a warp entity to control the minds of the Imperium's population. The novel is completely bonkers and of very questionable veracity nowadays. It's one of the very few novels that isn't quite considered canon, but it did a huge amount to set up the weird gothic sci-fi nature of the 40k setting, and it added a lot to how the Inquisition functions. One of the initial set pieces here involves Draco's gang working secretly on the planet of Stalinvast to observe the aftermath of a purge called by another Inquisitor, Hark Obispal. Obispal is this bombastic and charismatic figure, whereas Draco is much more secretive, and as a member of the Malleus, his job is to make sure that what Obispal is doing is actually working. His discovery that Obispal's purge seemed complete but actually revealed traces of the activities of the Hydra eventually leads to Draco authorizing exterminatus against the planet and then being excommunicated by rival factions in the Inquisition for his actions. And it's the first time we get this idea that there are political struggles within the Inquisition itself, differing philosophies, even more secret and radical orders trying to complete their own potentially heretical plans. The Inquisition depicted in these novels is much more like the Byzantine and backstabbing order we're used to. Of course, the rest of the novel's bonkers. It was followed by 2 sequels, Harlequin and Chaos Child, which between them have Jack Draco sneaking into the Emperor's throne room for a chat, invading Craftworld Ulthwy, gaining access to the Black Library and stealing the Book of the Rana Dandra, getting involved with the whole Illuminati Star Child plot that had been introduced in Realms of Chaos and would be jettisoned very quickly afterwards, and eventually becoming a sort of psychedelic space consciousness. When the 3 novels were eventually republished by Black Library as the Inquisition War Trilogy in 2004, with the original Inquisitor novel renamed Draco, the omnibus edition included a preface stating that nobody could find a record of any of these people, and it was probably all made up. And even now it carries a warning on the Black Library website saying that it's a glimpse of a not yet fully formed version of 40k, maybe readers should approach with caution. But for all its weirdness, it still did a lot to cement not only the tone and feel of the Imperium, the weird mix of mysticism and strange 80s sci-fi, but also the tone and feel of the Inquisition. Of course, after this, the setting was rebooted into 2nd edition 40k, and the Inquisition, like many of those smaller factions, sort of fell by the wayside for a while. Inquisitors were present in Codex Imperialis, the 2nd edition Get You By Army book, but otherwise they didn't appear or really get an update for the whole of the 90s. At the time, rebooting and representing Warhammer as a different sort of product took priority, but in the early 2000s, with the rise of the Specialist Game Studio and the growth of the Black Library, the Inquisition would once again become main characters. Inquisitor was a Games Workshop specialist game released in 2001, and it was a bit of an odd departure for the company. Through the 1990s, Games Workshop had grown massively, Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 becoming these big box products full of models that were marketed to a younger crowd than the old Rogue Trader had been. This was all the result of a buyout of the company and it becoming a PLC and marketing itself very differently. And in that change, some of the weirder elements of Rogue Trader, like the psychedelic space consciousness stuff, sort of fell by the wayside. Also in the 90s, Games Workshop had started this practice of releasing almost one-off boxed games every summer or two that were set within its existing Warhammer and 40k worlds. Often these would only really be supported for a year or two before they slowly drifted into the background. And by the early 2000s, with loads of these existing, many of them were reassigned to a new specialist game studio, and their format was moved from the classic big summer box to a more justifiable rulebook and mail order only metal range. Inquisitor was almost the only new game made in that mold. It was released as a single rulebook and it followed the actions of Inquisitors and their small warbands, and its accompanying metal range were unique in the fact that they were sculpted in 54mm, twice the size of regular Games Workshop models. Unlike many of its contemporaries, Inquisitor was also a sort of role-playing game. There were no points systems, players just assembled a warband of 3 or 4 models and then fought in little skirmishes based on the evolving story they came up with themselves, and since almost all the models were Inquisitors and their retinues, and there were no other 54mm models available, these conflicts were often framed as happening between rival Inquisitors, radicals and Puritans, all pursuing their own ends. There was a series of White Dwarf articles over the next few years that relayed the story of the game studio's own campaign, and while the game was a little weird and relatively short-lived, it sort of played like you were playing a role-playing game's combat system, and it only really lasted about 5 years. the effect that game and its offshoots had on the wider lore was a lot bigger. For one, the Inquisitor rulebook included the very first mentions of the many different philosophies of the Inquisition, presumably so the characters have something to fight over. This is where we first encounter Amalathians, Thorians, and Xanthites and their various disagreements, building on the ideas that were first introduced in that Inquisitor novel back in 1990. And the focus was back on the smaller engagements too. Warbands of just a couple of characters fighting through deserted Habs. Many of the characters introduced by the studio campaign, Inquisitor, Covenant, Deathwatch Sergeant Artemis, would outlive the game itself, but they were all overshadowed by the main character of the game's tie-in novel series, Gregor Eisenhorn. The first book in the Eisenhorn series appeared the same year with the release of Dan Abnett's Xenos, and it's this that finally put the pieces together for the Inquisition as they're portrayed today. Inquisitor Eisenhorn's story follows a career path that is familiar from many later novels. In the first book, he's a newcomer, functioning almost as a secret agent with a few reliable companions and limited resources, tracking cultists across a network of planets. By the second, he's a respected Inquisitor with a household staff and a small army of followers. And then by the third, he's a rogue whose past choices have caught up with him. He's bent on tracking down a heretic Inquisitor, while many of his peers see him as the heretic. Much more than in the Inquisition War trilogy, the Eisenhorn series establishes the idea that the fall to radicalism is a constant threat for members of the Inquisition, and in some cases, an inevitability. And that's a very human problem. Unlike the psychedelic state of consciousness, crazy sci-fi revelations of the Inquisition War, where Jack Draco is a renegade because all the authorities are wrong, with Eisenhorn, the threat for an Inquisitor is shown to be giving in to tempting ways to better do their job. Eisenhorn falls because in order to defend his comrades or track down his nemesis, he's forced to make use of more and more dangerous techniques until, in the eyes of his peers, he's barely distinguishable from the heretic he's hunting. The Eisenhorn series and its sequels, Ravener and now Bequin, broadly laid down the foundations for almost all inquisitorial narratives since, but on the tabletop, there were still some developments to make. In all the early 2000s products, the idea of the Ordo Malleus as a secret police force within the Inquisition had kind of been jettisoned. The Ordo Malleus still existed, but now they were just one of three major Ordos, joined by the Ordo Hereticus and the Ordo Xenos, all of which was seen in the Eisenhorn series. And that stuff all made its way onto the tabletop in the following couple of years. In 2003, the Daemonhunters Codex was released for 4th edition 40k, a book that combined the first full Grey Knights army list with a number of units to represent their bosses, the Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus. The lore in this book essentially sums up what had been recently published in the Inquisitor and Eisenhorn books, but with more of a focus on the battlefield. Much like back in the Realms of Chaos books, the Ordo Malleus were described as martial Inquisitors in powered armor, this time leading Eisenhorn-style bands of diverse followers, and this was all accompanied by a range of metal Grey Knight and Inquisition models, and models for inquisitorial stormtroopers. This book would be followed later the same year by the Witchhunters Codex, which did a similar job, combining the Sisters of Battle army list with the forces of the Ordo Hereticus. This book establishes the Sororitors as the chamber militant of the Ordo Hereticus, and also cements the Hereticus' different style. The stovepipe hats and antique-looking pistols all come from this book, designed to make them a counterpart to the rune-inscribed golden power armor of the Malleus. And then, at the time, a third codex was anticipated. The Deathwatch had already been released in a White Dwarf article in 2002. They weren't explicitly linked to the Ordo Xenos yet, but everyone was expecting that to happen with an Alien Hunters book, maybe. But for whatever reason, that codex never materialized. And the rest of 4th edition, and in fact all of 5th edition, passed without the Inquisition getting any more updates. And as far as the tabletop game of 40k goes, there isn't really much more to say. That Inquisition range of metal models from 2003 and 4 persisted for ages. They got the occasional PDF rules update. New characters would be released, from Kotiaz and Karamazov back in the 2000s through to Inquisitor Greyfax or Kyria Draxus in more recent times. But broadly, nothing else was added, all the way up to the present day, when Imperial agents are back as a codex, and smaller games like Kill Team have allowed the studio to justify plastic kits for all this stuff. On the tabletop, the Inquisition have kind of stayed the same since then. But of course, the Inquisition like to lurk in the shadows, and so more recently, the main place their lore and background saw development hasn't been in Games Workshop games at all, but in all the licensed RPGs, which makes a lot of sense, given the nature of the Inquisition. They were the subject of Fantasy Flight's first Warhammer tie-in, Dark Heresy, released in 2008. Broadly, the idea of the Inquisition here is the same one presented in the early 2000s. Small warbands of agents hunting down heretics and other inquisitors sometimes in the hive worlds of the Imperium. But the many supplements and campaigns presented here go into way more detail than ever before. Dark Heresy was published for almost a decade, and the books introduce niche followers, acolytes, ranks and training systems, and many, many more philosophies of the Inquisition. All of these are expanded massively, and the game did the same for many other non-battlefield agencies, with books on radical backgrounds, cults, imperial religion, law and the role of the RBTs. I really recommend giving them a read if you can get your hands on them. The stuff produced by Fantasy Flight in that decade is some of the most detailed lore ever written for 40k, going off into all sorts of weird tangents that explain the Imperium as like a functional place to live. Dark Heresy eventually stopped in 2017 when the RPG license was transferred over to Cubicle 7. And while the current role-playing games, Wrath of Glory and Imperium Maledictum, certainly do feature Inquisitors quite prominently, they're not quite as full-on and detailed as Dark Heresy was. The Inquisition has had a very weird journey through the background of 40k. They've been present since the very first book, but their importance has waxed and waned as Games Workshop have either concentrated on the core games or at other times allowed the weirder corners of the 40k universe to flourish. Unlike many other factions, the tabletop game has never really been their arena or the thing that has driven their development. Instead, it's the subsidiaries that have always found them useful as a faction, as good point-of-view characters for novels or as great protagonists for a role-playing game. Their lore only really got going when Games Workshop started making all those products a lot more. Thankfully, nowadays, things like novels, tie-in games, and video games are established parts of the 40k landscape. So with any luck, the Inquisition will be lurking in the background of the setting for the foreseeable future. And with Games Workshop's habit of reintroducing concepts from the past, surely it's only a matter of time before Inquisitor Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau returns to the setting. Right? Thanks for watching. If you'd like even more videos about the lore of 40k, you know I've got a second whole channel over on Arbitorian's Precinct House. You can see the Book Club and Tale of Four Gamers videos, and of course, if you just like this one, there'll be another video popping up there to your right. Also, like and subscribe, or visit the merch store for some silly t-shirts. See ya!